Imagine finally getting the answer you've been waiting for, and then having it snatched away hours later. That's exactly what happened to Prince Harry this week, and the story behind it is messier than anyone expected. For over a week, the British press had been obsessing over one single question: would Harry accept his father's invitation to stay at a royal residence during his upcoming trip to London? It sounds like a small, almost trivial detail, a housing arrangement, nothing more. But when you're talking about the Duke of Sussex and King Charles, nothing is ever just a housing arrangement. Every decision carries weight. Every yes or no gets picked apart for what it says about the state of their relationship. And this week, that question finally got an answer for about 24 hours. One moment, reports were confirming that Harry had accepted his father's offer to stay at Buckingham Palace. It felt like real news, the kind of small but symbolic gesture that suggested maybe, just maybe, this famously fractured family was inching towards something resembling normal. Then, almost as fast as the story broke, it fell apart. The palace pushed back. Then Harry's own team pushed back on the palace. By the time Monday, July 6th ended, what had briefly looked like a reconciliation moment had turned into another public disagreement, playing out through carefully worded statements to the press instead of an actual conversation between father and son. And here's what makes this bigger than a scheduling mix-up. The timing lines up almost perfectly with a courtroom decision that could put King Charles in an uncomfortable spot. This isn't just about where Harry sleeps for a few nights in London. It's about optics, timing, security, and a family that still can't seem to get on the same page even when they're trying to. It started with a BBC report that seemed to settle months of speculation. According to the outlet, Harry had accepted his father's offer to stay at Buckingham Palace during his upcoming London visit, and the report attributed that information directly to Harry's own spokesperson. For a moment, it looked like a genuine thaw. Royal watchers had been debating this exact possibility for days, wondering whether Harry would choose to stay somewhere neutral, somewhere private, or whether he'd finally accept his father's hospitality directly. When the BBC report landed, it seemed to answer that question definitively. Harry was staying at the palace. Case closed. Except it wasn't closed at all. Almost as quickly as the story broke, Buckingham Palace pushed back, telling reporters that the BBC's version of events wasn't accurate. Within the same morning, headlines flipped from "Harry accepts palace offer" to "Palace denies Harry accepted," to nobody being entirely sure what was actually true. Journalists covering the royal beat were left scrambling, trying to figure out which version of the story to run with. Some outlets updated their headlines 2 or 3 times within a few hours. It was the kind of confusion that doesn't happen by accident in royal communications, where every statement is usually managed down to the word, vetted by press offices, and released with careful timing. This wasn't a case of one junior staffer misspeaking. This was a full contradiction between what one side said and what the other confirmed, playing out in real time, in public, for anyone paying attention to see. Something else was clearly going on behind the scenes, and it would take Harry's own team stepping in later that day to give the fuller picture. While the palace and BBC sorted out their conflicting stories, a bigger issue was quietly shaping the whole visit, one that had actually been brewing for much longer than this single week of confusion. Harry had already decided, before any of this palace back and forth even happened, that he'd be arriving in London without his wife or children. Meghan, Archie, and Lilibet would be staying behind in the United States. The reason traces back to a much longer, more serious battle: Harry's ongoing fight over taxpayer-funded police protection in the UK, handled by a body known as RAVEC, the Executive Committee for the Protection of Royalty and Public Figures. That committee had already denied the family the level of security Harry says they genuinely need whenever they're in the country. And despite what was supposed to be a fresh review of that original decision, the answer came back the same. No extra protection was coming, taxpayer-funded or otherwise. For Harry, this isn't an abstract concern. It's the reason his wife and 2 young children won't be joining him in London at all. According to a statement his team shared with the public back on June 29th, the entire issue comes down to one thing: whether appropriate and proportionate protective security can be guaranteed for the full length of any visit, not just parts of it. The king had reportedly offered accommodation at a royal estate, but the security coverage tied to that offer wouldn't extend beyond the property itself, meaning the family could technically stay somewhere safe. But the moment they stepped outside that specific location, the protection picture became far murkier. For days leading up to this trip, Harry's team was reportedly exploring alternative options, private security packages, increased coverage paid for out-of-pocket, anything that might bridge the gap left by Ravek's decision. It's worth pausing on what that actually means. This is a father trying to find a way, through his own resources and connections, to bring his children back to the country where he grew up. Archie is 7. Lilibet is 5. Neither of them has really known the UK the way Harry did at their age. This was supposed to be their chance. In the end, those arrangements didn't come together in time for the whole family to make the trip. So the outcome became this. Harry travels to London alone for now, while the question of whether his family joins him for other parts of the visit, outside the capital, potentially with different security considerations, remains completely open. Once the did he or didn't he accept the palace offer question was out there, the two sides started telling noticeably different versions of the very same week. This is where things get genuinely tangled, because both versions can't be fully true at the same time, and yet neither side has really backed down from their account. Palace sources claim that Harry had until the end of the previous week to formally accept the accommodation offer, giving royal household staff enough time to actually prepare the residence for his stay. According to that version of events, Harry initially declined the offer outright. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, he reversed course and accepted it later, specifically on Saturday, July 4th. From the palace's perspective, this reads like indecision. A prince who said no, then changed his mind at the 11th hour, creating logistical headaches for staff who needed lead time to prepare. Harry's team frames the exact same sequence of events completely differently. According to his spokesperson, the delay wasn't hesitation or indecision at all. It was purely about logistics tied to security. The claim is that the Duke spent the previous week making alternative security arrangements for the trip, given Ravek's refusal to provide coverage. Only once those arrangements were actually finalized and confirmed did he feel in a position to formally accept the accommodation offer for himself. In other words, it wasn't that he couldn't decide whether he wanted to stay at the palace. It's that he needed to know his own safety situation was sorted before committing to anything. Two very different explanations for the same 48 hours. One version paints Harry as wavering. The other paints him as methodical, waiting on serious security logistics before making a decision that affects his own safety. And whichever version people choose to believe, one detail is agreed upon by both sides. The acceptance did happen eventually, over the weekend, which makes what came next even harder to explain away. On Monday, July 6th, Harry's spokesperson released a statement that didn't hold back and didn't tiptoe around who it was addressing. It directly called out Buckingham Palace's own briefings from the previous week, briefings that had suggested, according to Harry's team, that the Duke hadn't accepted anything at all, that this was all still up in the air. Harry's spokesperson made a point of noting they were aware of multiple briefings coming from the palace side, making that exact claim. The statement then laid out the Duke's version of the full sequence plainly. Following Ravek's decision not to extend security coverage to his family, Harry spent the week making alternative arrangements on his own. Once those arrangements were confirmed and in place, he was finally able to formally accept the accommodation offer, for himself, not for Meghan or the children, since they weren't coming regardless, sometime over the weekend. And then, according to the statement, withdrawn. Just like that. The reason given, based on what Harry's team was told, centered on a legal judgment expected the very next day, Tuesday, July 7th. The idea being floated was that King Charles couldn't be seen accommodating his son at a royal residence, while a live legal case involving major British newspapers was still pending a verdict. But here's the detail that turns this from a simple scheduling issue into something that looks a lot more deliberate. According to Harry's statement, Buckingham Palace had reportedly known about that judgment date since the previous Thursday, days before Harry ever formally accepted the offer in the first place. If that timeline is accurate, it raises an obvious question that Harry's own spokesperson pointed to directly. Why accept the offer at all, only to withdraw it once it was already locked in, over a court date the palace apparently already knew was coming? It's the kind of detail that doesn't have an easy, comfortable explanation. Either the palace didn't fully think through the implications of the pending court case before making the offer, or something else changed between Thursday and Monday that hasn't been made public. Either way, the statement made clear that Harry's side considers the timing unclear, at best, a polite, diplomatic way of saying they don't buy the official reasoning. That judgment isn't some minor legal footnote buried in a British newspaper's business section. It's part of a much larger, more high-profile case. Harry brought legal action against the publishers of the Daily Mail and the Mail on Sunday, and he wasn't doing it alone. His co-claimants in the case include some genuinely major names, musician Elton John and actress Elizabeth Hurley among them. With a ruling landing the very same week as Harry's visit, specifically on Tuesday, July 7th, the day after the accommodation offer was pulled, palace insiders reportedly worried that King Charles couldn't be seen publicly housing his son at a royal residence while that legal battle against a major British newspaper group was still actively working its way through the courts. It's an optics problem more than anything else. The monarchy has spent years trying to project neutrality, trying to avoid the appearance of taking sides in disputes between individuals and the press, even when one of those individuals happens to be the king's own son. Think about how that would look from the palace's perspective. If Harry is staying under the same roof as the king, actively being hosted by the institution, at the exact moment a court hands down a ruling in his favor, or even against him, against a newspaper group, it creates an awkward visual. Was the king somehow involved? Did staying at the palace signal royal support for one side of a media lawsuit? These are the kinds of questions palace communications teams exist specifically to avoid ever having to answer. Whether or not that's the complete and honest explanation, it's the one that's been offered publicly through palace sources. And it happens to land on the very same day Harry also kicks off a series of Invictus Games events in London, the charity and sporting event he founded for wounded, injured, and sick servicemen and women. So Tuesday, July 7th was already shaping up to be an enormous day for Harry, professionally and legally, even before you factor in a public falling out with his father's household playing out through dueling press statements. None of this is happening in a vacuum, and it's worth stepping back to understand the broader relationship this single incident is sitting inside of. Harry and King Charles last saw each other in person back in September 2025, nearly a year before this current trip. That's not exactly the cadence of a father and son who are on easy, comfortable terms. Every visit since Harry formally stepped back from royal duties in 2020 has come with its own layer of scrutiny, its own set of questions about where things currently stand between them. Meghan's situation is even more stark. She hasn't set foot in the United Kingdom at all since September 2022, when she and Harry extended their stay in Europe specifically to attend the funeral events following Queen Elizabeth's death. That trip, as Harry later wrote in his memoir Spare, ended up being the longest stretch of time he and Meghan had ever spent away from Archie and Lilibet up to that point. It's a detail that speaks to just how disruptive these overseas trips have historically been for the family and why security and logistics questions carry so much extra weight now. So when people talk about tension existing beneath all the carefully polite public statements, this is the backdrop they're pointing to. Years of physical distance. Occasional, tentative attempts to close the gap. A visit here, a phone call there, reports of behind-the-scenes efforts at reconciliation. And then moments exactly like this one, which seem to reopen old wounds just as quickly as any progress gets made. It's a pattern that's played out repeatedly since 2020. Cautious optimism about a thaw, followed by some new complication that sends the narrative right back to conflict. With Meghan, Archie, and Lilibet staying behind in the US, the question hanging over this entire visit is a simple one. Will there be any kind of family reunion at all during this trip, in any form? Harry had reportedly hoped this visit could finally give his children a genuine chance to experience the country where he grew up, to see the places that shaped his own childhood, and maybe, just maybe, spend real, unstructured time with their grandfather, the king. For a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old, that's a significant milestone, one their father was clearly hoping to make happen. Now, with the London leg of the trip happening solo, and the palace accommodation offer pulled entirely off the table, it's genuinely unclear whether the rest of the week changes that picture at all.